Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I never wanted to be part of this. If I had known what was coming, I would have walked away the moment I stepped into that lab. But some things are bigger than fear. Some things demand answers. My name is Dr. Alan Reeves, and I was one of the lead researchers at Blackwood Biotech, a private facility hidden deep in the forests of Colorado. Our project was officially called NVX-109, a cutting-edge antiviral meant to revolutionize medicine. But behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. NVX-109 wasn't designed to cure. It was meant to control. The idea was simple: a pathogen that could rewrite neural pathways, turning hostile minds into obedient ones. A virus that could influence behavior without force, without violence. The perfect tool for order. The perfect solution for chaos. That's what we were told. That's what we believed. The test subjects, prison volunteers they called them, showed promising results at first. Their aggression levels dropped. Their responses became more compliant. It was working, until it wasn't. It started with Subject A12. His vitals spiked out of nowhere. He wasn't sedated, but he stopped moving, just staring at the observation glass, unblinking. The EEG monitor showed erratic activity, like his brain was trying to reboot. Then he collapsed. For 3 minutes, he was completely unresponsive. Then, without warning, he sat up. But something was wrong. His breathing was slow, unnatural. His pupils had dilated so much that his irises were nearly black. And when he turned to look at us, it wasn't just a glance. It was like he was seeing through us. Then came the screaming. Not from him, from the other test subjects. One by one, they convulsed their bodies, twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Their mouths foamed, their eyes rolled back, and then silence. For a moment, I thought we had just witnessed mass organ failure. Then they began to move. Not like people, not even like animals. Like something else entirely. Something that had just woken up. We should have evacuated the moment we saw them move. We should have sealed the lab, burned everything, and never looked back. But we hesitated. We were scientists, not soldiers. We had protocol safeguards for every possible scenario, except this one, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Dr. Keller was the first to react. She slammed the emergency lockdown button, sealing the observation chamber with reinforced steel shutters. At least we weren't in the same room as them. At least we had that. But that small victory meant nothing when we saw what came next. The test subjects stood motionless in the flickering fluorescent light. Their bodies trembled like puppets held up by invisible strings. Then, one by one, they turned to face Subject A12, and he smiled. No words, no sound. Just that slow, unnatural grin that sent ice down my spine. Then he lunged, not at us, but at the others. His fingers tore into Subject B7's skin like paper. There was no hesitation, no struggle, just raw, terrifying strength. The others, they didn't fight back. They just stood there, twitching, convulsing, like they were trying to resist something inside them. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, they joined him. The security feed turned to static. The last thing we saw before the cameras went dark was a blur of motion, teeth, hands, blood, and then the screaming started. Not theirs, ours. Because the steel shutters that were supposed to contain them? They didn't. The reinforced glass cracked. Not from impact, not from force. From the inside. Something was wrong with the air in that chamber. The biometric sensors started flashing warnings we didn't understand. Spikes in neural activity, but no sign of life. Heart rates that shouldn't be possible, some flatlining entirely before restarting at inhuman levels. And then, through the broken feed, I saw it. Subject. A 12 looked straight into the camera, and his lips moved. No sound came through, no audio, but I knew what he was saying. Let us out. And then, the glass shattered. The lockdown failed. The doors opened, and the nightmare truly began. The alarms shrieked through the facility. Red emergency lights bathed the lab in a pulsing glow, turning every corner into a shifting nightmare of shadows. I grabbed Dr. Keller's arm. We have to go, now. But she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the shattered observation window. The test subjects, if you could still call them that, were already spilling into the hallway. They weren't running. They didn't have to. They knew we had nowhere to go. Security was already in position. A dozen armed guards lined the corridor, rifles raised, fingers hovering over the triggers. "Stand down! Get on the ground now!" one of them barked. A 12 took a step forward. His head twitched unnaturally to the side, his grin never fading. The others moved with him, their limbs jerking like marionettes, muscles tightening under skin that looked too stretched, too wrong. And then, all at once, they charged. The first gunshot rang out like a thunderclap, and then the hallway erupted into chaos. Bullets shredded through torsos, limbs, even heads, but they didn't fall. Not right away. One of them, Subject C4, lost half his skull in the first volley. He staggered, his head snapping backward from the impact. I thought, hoped, that was enough. Then he straightened. His left eye was gone, his cheek a mangled mess of bone and tissue. But he was still moving. The guards weren't ready for that. A 12 reached them first. His hand wrapped around the nearest soldier's neck, and before the man could react, snap, one after another, they were pulled down, ripped apart, torn open. We ran. Keller and I sprinted down the opposite corridor, weaving through emergency bulkheads that were failing one by one. Behind us, the screams were getting quieter. Not because the guards were winning, because there were less of them left to scream. We reached the central control room, slamming the door behind us and engaging the final lockdown. Heavy blast doors sealed shut, trapping us inside with only one way out: the emergency escape tunnel. Keller was shaking. She turned to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Alan, we didn't make a virus, we made something else." I didn't want to believe her. But the security monitors flickered, showing the horror unfolding across the facility. The infected weren't mindless. They weren't wandering like the zombies in bad movies. They were hunting. They were thinking. And worst of all, they were learning. The security monitors flickered with grainy, red-tinged images of the facility. The infected were everywhere. A researcher sprinted through Lab 6, clutching his side. He barely made it 3 steps before something yanked him into the shadows. Another screen showed a lone guard barricading himself in the mess hall, shoving tables against the doors. The lights flickered, then went out completely. When they came back on, he was gone. I turned away. I couldn't watch anymore. Dr. Keller was gripping the edge of the console, her breath coming fast and shallow. She pulled up the fail-safe protocols, scrolling frantically. There had to be a way to contain this. "We can gas the lower levels," she muttered. "Flood the ventilation system with halothane. It might shut down their nervous systems." I barely heard her. My eyes were locked on camera 7. The hallway outside the control room. Something was moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not running, not shambling, walking. And then he appeared. Subject, A12. His clothes were torn, stained dark with things I didn't want to think about. His skin was pale, but not lifeless. There was something behind his eyes. Something aware. He stopped in front of the control room door and just stood there. Then, without looking away from the camera, he reached up and knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Keller choked back a sob. "Oh God, Alan. They know." I forced myself to move. "We have to go, now." She hesitated, just for a second, but a second was too much. The sound of metal groaning filled the room. I turned just in time to see the control room door buckle inward. A 12 wasn't breaking it down. He was pulling it open. With his bare hands. I grabbed Keller's wrist and yanked her toward the emergency tunnel. The bulkhead hissed as it opened, revealing a dark, narrow escape route leading towards the surface. We ran. Behind us, the door gave way with the screech of tearing steel, and then the lights flickered out. Total darkness. And in that black void right behind us, I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Not running, not rushing, just following. The emergency tunnel was never meant for comfort. It was a tight, suffocating corridor of concrete and steel, barely wide enough for 2 people. The air was thick with the scent of rust and damp earth, and every footstep echoed like a gunshot. We ran. The tunnel stretched ahead in eerie, suffocating darkness, the only light coming from flickering red emergency beacons embedded in the walls. Keller's breath came in ragged gasps beside me. Behind us, the footsteps. Still slow, still patient. A 12 wasn't running. He didn't have to. We reached the first checkpoint, a sealed security door leading to the maintenance sector. Keller fumbled at the keypad, her fingers shaking too much to hit the right sequence. I turned. The tunnel behind us stretched into an abyss of flickering shadows. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. Watching, waiting. Click, the door unlocked. We shoved through and slammed it behind us, sealing it with trembling hands. Silence. Keller bent forward, hands on her knees. "Alan, bang!" We both jumped. A single heavy knock against the door, and then a second one. I backed away, pulse hammering in my ears. Then came the third. Just like before, slow, measured, mocking. I grabbed Keller's wrist and pulled her down the tunnel. "Don't stop. Don't look back." The maintenance sector was worse than the last tunnel. The walls were lined with old, abandoned equipment, rusted pipes, and broken conduits. Somewhere ahead, the tunnel sloped upward, toward the surface exit. We just had to reach it. Then the overhead lights flickered and died. Darkness. Complete, utter blackness. Keller made a choked sound, and I clamped a hand over her mouth. And that's when we heard it. Not the footsteps. Not the knocking. Something else, breathing. Deep. Slow. Right behind us. Something cold brushed against my shoulder. And then a voice. Not loud, not aggressive. Just a whisper. Right in my ear. "Let us out." I grabbed Keller's arm and ran. We ran blind. The tunnel sloped upward, but in the darkness, every step felt like we were falling instead of climbing. My lungs burned. Keller's grip on my arm was iron tight, her nails digging into my skin. Neither of us dared to look back. The breathing behind us never stopped. It stayed close, right at the edge of the blackness, just out of reach. And then, finally, light. A faint glow ahead, spilling from the final checkpoint, the surface exit. The steel hatch that led outside. Our way out. We sprinted for it. The emergency panel was already blinking red when we reached it. Lockdown engaged. Keller cursed, already punching in override codes. Her fingers flew over the keypad, the numbers coming out in panicked, breathless gasps. "Come on, come on!" A soft knock echoed behind us. We froze. Another knock. And then a third. I turned my head just a fraction and saw him. A 12 stood in the darkness of the tunnel, just outside the reach of the emergency lights. His face was barely visible, his eyes reflecting the dim glow like an animal's. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, more shadows shifted, more figures, more faces. All of them watching. All of them waiting. A 12 tilted his head, that same eerie, unnatural smile never leaving his face. Then, he took a step forward. I turned back to Keller. "Open it. Beep." The lockdown disengaged. The hatch hissed as it released, a rush of cold night air spilling into the tunnel. We didn't hesitate. We threw ourselves through the opening, collapsing onto damp grass, gasping for breath. The moment we were out, the hatch slammed shut behind us. For a few seconds, we just lay there shaking. Then Keller sat up, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. We made it. I wanted to believe her, but something wasn't right. The forest around us was silent. No wind, no insects, not even the distant rustle of leaves. And then a knock, from inside the hatch. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks, and a voice muffled but unmistakable. "Let us out." Keller scrambled away from the hatch, her breath coming in panicked gasps. I didn't blame her, because I wasn't sure if we had escaped or if we had just let it out. The knocks had stopped, but the forest remained dead silent. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. The Blackwood Biotech Facility sat behind us, buried beneath the earth. The surface entrance was supposed to be off the grid, but my gut told me something was wrong. Then Keller's voice trembled through the quiet. "Alan, look." I followed her gaze. There, in the soft mud and grass outside the hatch, were our footprints. 2 sets, leading out from the tunnel. But a few feet away, another set of footprints branched off from ours. Bare, deep, not ours, leading into the trees. I felt my blood go cold. Keller clutched my arm. How could that be? I didn't have an answer, because those footprints meant one of 2 things. Either we weren't alone when we escaped, or something had already been waiting for us out here. A breeze finally stirred the trees, but it carried no relief, only a faint, sickly smell. Something rotting. Keller was shaking her head. No, snap. A branch broke in the distance. We both spun toward the sound. The forest loomed ahead, dark and endless. The footprints led directly into the trees, vanishing into the shadows. And then a shape moved between the trunks, not running, not hiding, just standing there, watching, smiling. A 12. Except it wasn't possible. The hatch was closed, the tunnel was sealed. He shouldn't be out here. And yet, he was. Keller grabbed my wrist. "We have to go." I didn't move, because a 12 wasn't alone. The trees shifted. More figures emerged from the darkness. Some dressed in lab coats, some in security uniforms, all of them grinning. And then they started walking toward us. Not running, not rushing, just following, like they had all the time in the world. They kept coming. Slow, steady footsteps crunching over leaves and twigs. Keller was pulling at me, her grip iron tight. "Alan, move." But I couldn't. Not yet. Because I was starting to understand. And the truth was worse than anything I'd imagined. A 12, and the others weren't infected. They weren't monsters. They were something else, something that could think, something that could choose. They weren't just wandering blindly, chasing movement like mindless creatures. They had planned this. They had let us escape. They wanted us out here. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. The virus hadn't spread. It had evolved. Keller let out a sharp sob. "Alan, we have to go, now." I forced my legs to move. We ran. The facility was deep in the woods, but I knew there was an old service road not far from here. If we could reach it, maybe we could find a way out. Branches whipped against my face as we tore through the undergrowth. Every step felt like running through a nightmare that wouldn't end. But the worst part, they never broke into a sprint. They just kept walking. Like they knew we had nowhere to go. Like they had done this before. The trees thinned, and suddenly, we burst onto a cracked, overgrown road. Keller nearly collapsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What now?" I spun, scanning the horizon, and then headlights. A vehicle, coming fast. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms, screaming. The truck skidded to a stop, and a man leaned out, a ranger maybe, or a worker from the facility's outer perimeter. "What the hell are you two doing out here?" "Drive," I gasped. "Get us out of here, now." He hesitated, just for a second. Then his eyes flickered over my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know what he saw. His face went pale. Jesus. That was all he managed before Keller and I threw ourselves into the truck. The moment the doors slammed shut, the ranger stomped the gas. The tires shrieked and we sped away from the woods. I risked one last glance out the back window. A 12 stood at the edge of the tree line. Still smiling. Still watching. The others stood with him, their faces calm, unbothered. They weren't running after us. They didn't need to. Because the truth hit me all at once. We hadn't escaped. They had let us go. And as the truck roared down the road, a single thought echoed in my head, chilling and absolute. This isn't over. Not even close. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.